Hi guys, how you doing? Can you hear me? Hello.
We can hear you.
Awesome. So in the last lecture, we talk about training for maximal strength, and we discuss how it's important to use heavy loads in order to stimulate properly the muscle, in order to obtain the adaptation, especially of the nervous system, that let the muscle be more activated. And you can assess this kind of adaptation by measuring the EMG using electromyography, typically surface electromyography, and following a period of resistance training, and in particular, high intensity resistance training, you may find some increase in the neural activation of the muscle. We also talk about a phenomenon that is called post-activation performance enhancement. Do you remember what is this phenomenon? Do you remember? What is this kind of post-activation performance enhancement effect? And how to stimulate it, how to obtain it? Nobody remember that? So when you perform a power exercise following an high intensity resistance exercise consisting in only a few reps but perform at high intensity, you may experience an improvement in the power performance that follows the high intensity exercise. This was introduced to explain the two main effects, acute effect of resistance exercise. So every time you perform a resistance exercise, you have two different effects. One is related to a potentiation. So immediately after the exercise, you may have some sort of potentiation in terms of power or strength, but also an effect of fatigue. If fatigue is more elevated compared to the potentiation effect, then fatigue is the only phenomenon that will be apparent, that will exist. However, if the exercise, the conditioning exercise performed before a power test is minimal in the volume but at high intensity, for example, 2 repetitions at 90% of 1 RM, that may be enough to stimulate a post-activation performance enhancement. However, if instead of performing only 2 repetitions at 90% of 1 RM, we perform 3 sets of 2 repetitions at 90%, even if the recovery time is 3 minutes between the sets, we will not see any positive effect, and maybe we will register a drop in performance. Why? Because in correspondence of an increased volume of high intensity training, there is a bigger impact of fatigue compared to the positive effect of potentiation. Okay, that is the post-activation performance enhancement. Is a physiological effect that lasts for minutes, between typically 5 to 12 minutes, depending by the exercise. For example, the time in which you can have an effect, a positive effect of post-activation performance enhancement may be different following squat or bench press. However, due to the fact that when you stimulate the same muscle at high intensity and then for power, fatigue may appear, we did some studies that we described during the last lecture, in which we tested the non-localized effect of post-activation performance enhancement. So basically, we did some studies in which we perform exercises for the upper body, and we tested individuals for lower body power. And in different studies, we measure some significant effect. So basically, when the individuals perform high intensity bench press, few number of repetitions and high intensity, following 8 minutes, they were able to jump more compared to baseline. Why? Because of the non-localized post-activation performance enhancement. This effect is probably related to mental activation. So you have a lot of catecholamine around in the circulation. And catecholamines such as adrenaline can increase the amount of calcium that is released within the sarcomere. That may be an explanation of the effect. However, there is also another explanation that is related to the activation of the heavy chain of myosin that may increase the force produced. However, if you weigh too much from the high intensity exercise and the subsequent power exercise, the effect will be expired. That's the reason why some coaches try to use this physiological effect in competition. However, that may be quite an issue because the effect lasts for only a few minutes, and the energy that you use, both mental and physiological energy that you use to stimulate the body with an high intensity exercise, you will not have this energy later during the competition. So it's a little bit tricky, even because typically the activation during the day of the competition is already very elevated, and this physiological effect may be minimized. Some authors, for example, try to apply these concepts to shot put, for example. So during the warm-up, some of the throwers were asked to use shots that were heavier compared to the regular competitive shots. And apparently some of them obtain an increase in performance. They were young shot putters, so not advanced athletes. For them, maybe a little bit different the effect. Okay. And we talk a little bit about cross education. Do you remember what is cross education? That is partially related to non-localized post-activation performance enhancement. Do you remember what is cross education?
When you work on one side of the body and there is improvement on the other side.
Awesome. Yes. And scientists start to talk about that in 1896, so a long time ago. However, only more recently, there are some explanation and theory beyond that effect. Is there any effect on muscle sides in the opposite, in the contralateral side of the body when you train just one arm, for example? What do you think?
Probably not.
Obviously not. However, if resistance exercise may stimulate circulating testosterone, as was said in the 80s or in the 90s, some non-localized effect may be possible. However, right now, as we will say when we will start to talk about hypertrophy, during, I don't know if during that class or the next, we will understand more about hypertrophy and how important are local mechanism of protein synthesis and protein synthesis stimulation, more than circulating hormones, local versus circulating and global. Okay, so let's introduce the today's class. It is actually about power training. Share. Okay, can you see the presentation? I think so.
Yes.
Nice. So why we need to work on maximal strength if the goal is to improve speed or speed strength or strength speed or more generally power? Because some mechanisms of the production of power are the same compared to the production of maximum force. If you take a look at the body of this thrower, Ilona Zlupianek, that won the Olympic Games in 1980 in Moscow in shot put, if you take a look at her type, you can find that the quad are really hypertrophic. But at the end, the load that she was supposed to accelerate was for her minimal, 4 kilograms. So why she need such a big quad in order to accelerate a load that is not actually so much? Because some of the mechanism are, there is an overlapping between some mechanism of maximal strength and on power. For example, powerful athletes are typically able to quickly accelerate loads, of course, if they are powerful. However, in order to be able to accelerate loads, they need a high number of fast fibers. High number of fast fibers means that in their muscle they have thousands of fast fibers. Another concept is the percentage of fast fiber within the muscle of an individual. Because an individual may have a high number of fast fiber, but a lower percentage of fast fiber compared to the other muscle fibers. Because the number of muscle fibers in different individuals is different. So if you have more muscle fibers in the number, typically you may experience more hypertrophy more easily compared to individuals that have a lower number of muscle fiber. In particular, if you have in your muscle a high number of muscle fiber and a high percentage of fast fiber, you may be able to increase a lot the size of the muscle and also the quickness, the speed. Probably within the quad of Ilona Zlupianek, the athlete in the picture, she had a high number of muscle fibers and also a high percentage of fast fibers, okay? She was very powerful at the end. But if in my muscle there are a high number of fast fibers, I may be quick, but also strong, because fast fibers are able to produce much more elevated tension compared to slow fibers. And fast fibers are much more prone to increase their size via hypertrophy compared to slow fibers, okay? Typically, powerful athletes are able to produce very high maximum tensions. Why? Because they have a lot of fast fibers. And typically because they are also strong in order to be powerful. But in order to obtain the optimal activation of the muscle, both in maximal strength and power, you need an optimal motor unit recruitment. Because the motor units composed by fast fibers are characterized by the highest threshold of activation. So in order to be able to activate, to use that kind of motor units, you need to be able to properly recruit them by a very high firing rate. So this is due to the central nervous system, okay? And the possibility to recruit fast fibers is important for both maximal strength and also for speed and strength speed. So there are some overlapping between the two kind of force, maximal strength and power. So there are some physiological similarities between maximal strength and power. So high maximal forces, high number of fast fibers. Because if the individual is able to produce high level of forces, then a certain load represent a lower percentage of the maximum strength. And by the relationship between load and speed, we know that at low percentages of the maximum strength, each individual is able to obtain a higher acceleration. Also, the high number of fast fiber is important for both high speed and high maximal strength. Okay, in the picture you can see an Italian shot putter of the 80s that was Olympic champion in Los Angeles 1984, and of course he was able to accelerate a lot the shot that for male athletes is 7.2 kilograms, but he was also very strong. His one ramming bench was about 270 kilograms. And consider that in the Olympic final of shot put, there is no one athlete that cannot lift at least 250 kilograms in bench press. So in order to obtain such a big power that consent you to accelerate the shot, you need to be enough strong. If you analyze the maximum level of force of the national track and field team of the United States, especially for throwers, is unbelievable. So the amount of force that they can produce in a squat, deadlift, bench, and also snatch, clean and jerk. So exercises related to Olympic powerlifting is unbelievable. We will talk about that. Okay, so optimal motor unit recruitment is very important for them. So the recruitment of high traction motor unit is important for both maximal strength and explosive strength. Okay, we already say that. So the importance of maximal strength, however, is bigger when the mass to be accelerated is heavier. If your goal is to accelerate a baseball ball, that is 142 grams, maximum strength may be quite important, but not as important as a shot putter that need to accelerate a 7.2 kilogram shot. So in relation to the amount of mass that should be accelerated, maximum force is more or less important. Typically, some athletes that need to accelerate heavy loads, such as weightlifter, they require very high maximum force. Weightlifting, of course, is sometimes considered as a maximum strength sport. However, the most important characteristic is power for them. So weightlifters are supposed to produce a lot of power with heavy loads. That's the principal characteristics of them. So in order to be able to accelerate very quickly heavy loads, they need to have a high level of maximum force. Okay? But why improvements in the maximum strength influence the power? Because, for example, if this individual, Romano, can accelerate 75 kilogram at the bench press throw at 0.9 meter per second, and his 1RM is 150 kilogram, that load, 75 kilos, represent the 50% of 1RM. However, we can calculate the power by multiplying the force, that is actually the weight, the load on the bar, multiplied for 9.8 in order to obtain Newton. So 75 multiplied for 9.8, 735 Newton. We multiply that value for the speed of the bar, and we obtain the power, 681 watt. Okay. However, following 4 months of resistance training, his 1RM may be increased to 165 kilogram at the bench press. So 75 kilogram is not anymore his 50%, but represent now 45%. So he should be able to accelerate more the same load, for example, at 1.1 meter per second. And now the same calculation lead to 808 watt, with an increase of about more than 120 watt. Okay, so the increase in maximal strength produce an increase in the possibility to accelerate the same load, because the same load then represent a lower percentage of the 1RM, and with lower percentage of 1RM you may be able to obtain a higher level of speed. Okay, some individual may be strong without being powerful, because, for example, some power lifters that they do not work a lot on power, and they have a lot of fibers, but mainly intermediate fibers. They may not be so powerful. However, it's very rare that powerful individuals are not enough strong. So a base of strength is very important to be powerful. Okay, some examples. For example, this English shot putter of the 80s, Geoff Capes, was able to throw the shot at 21 and 68. That is quite a good measure. Then he moved and he became one of the first strongmen, and he was able to do 300 kilos in bench press, raw, squat 380 kilos, deadlift 454 kilograms. So he was actually very strong, even if his main purpose was to accelerate the shot. So the amount of force that is required to accelerate something is related to the to how heavy is the object to be accelerated. Okay. Ben Johnson, for example, that was a former 100-meter sprinters, Olympic champion in Seoul 1988, and then disqualified for Winstron, a kind of testosterone. He was able to bench 184 kilograms, and his body mass was about 77 kilograms. So he was actually very strong. Also, you can say, of course, he was Jewish. However, so he was taking testosterone, but you know, that was not probably the only reason. The reason is that maximal force is important also to obtain high level of power. Okay. Do you remember if you perform an incremental test at the bench press and you measure the power at different loads, you may find this kind of bell graph. So at the beginning, there is an increase in the power, 20%, 40% of 1 RM. There is an increase in power produced because the ratio between load on the bar and speed is positive. But when you overcome 60% of 1 RM, typically, but this value can be also lower, 40, 50, depending by the individual, then the power is lower and is going down. And at the end, with 100% of 1 RM, the power produced is very low compared to the peak of power. You remember why it may be important to know for a strength power individual is load corresponding to the peak power? You remember why it is important? Because this load is the most stimulating to increase power. So if we want to increase the power of our athlete, knowing that load consent us to use a proper load to stimulate them. So if we use the load corresponding to the peak of power, we can be sure that this power is going to be optimally stimulated. However, sometimes we may decide to work with lower loads in order to work more on strength speed compared to the peak of power. Okay. And sometimes we may also decide to use heavier load compared to the load corresponding to the peak of power in order to work to stimulate the power produced at heavier load, depending by the sport played by the individual. For example, if we are working with a baseball thrower, we need to work in the left portion of the curve. If we are working, on the contrary, with power lifters, we need to work in the right portion of the force power curve. Okay, that is very important because based upon the load that we use during a power training session, we may stimulate specific adaptation. You remember, adaptation is always something that respects the rule of specificity. So the rule of specificity say that if you work out at a specific angle, then most of the improvement in force or power may be obtained at that angle. If you work out at a specific speed, then the most of the positive effect will be at this specific speed. Okay, that is the principle of specificity. Okay, so between 30 and 60% of the 1 RM, typically there is the peak of power. When you are fatigued, when you are coming from an accumulation phase of a block periodized program, for example, typically the percentage of 1 RM corresponding to the peak of power is more elevated, because at that time you are not able to properly accelerate submaximal load, because fatigue influences a lot power, and more power than maximal strength. So power at the end is very sensitive for fatigue, more than maximal strength. Each individual has a specific characteristic. Some individual may be able to produce the peak of power at 40% of 1 RM, while other individuals may be able to produce the peak of power at 65%, usually no more than that. Okay. Okay, so resistance training aims to increase the rate of power production, so performing the same range of motion in a shorter amount of time. So typically, one of the goals of power training is not to reduce the range of motion. For example, a baseball thrower is supposed to use the bigger range of motion as possible, because if he has a long trajectory in which he can accelerate the ball, then the result may be better compared to reducing the range of motion. However, the goal of power training is to performing the same range of motion quicker. Okay, so the individual maximum strength increase, then the same load represents a lower percentage of the maximum strength, and the acceleration will be more elevated. We talk about that. If we increase the maximum force, then the same amount of load represents a lower percentage of the 1 RM, and then can be accelerated quicker. But working out for power and for resistance exercise change some of the morphological characteristics of the muscle. Do you remember what are the main characteristics that can be measured with muscle ultrasound? We talk about that. So one of the most important is the thickness of the muscle. And the thickness of the muscle is a parameter that is highly related to cross-sectional area. Why cross-sectional area is important? Because at the end, even if now some papers come off about the fact that hypertrophy is sometimes not related so much with maximum strength. However, theoretically, a bigger muscle is able to produce an higher level of force, because a lot of sarcomeres works together in parallel. So if the muscle is bigger and if hypertrophy occur, then a higher number of sarcomere will work together and the amount of force produced will be more elevated. That's the reason why we were able to publish a paper a few weeks ago that consent to estimate the 1 RM in bench press based upon the thickness of the pectoral muscle. So if there were no relationship between the muscle mass and maximum force, then the equation we develop will never work, and this equation is working properly. So okay, so one of the parameters is muscle thickness. However, in some muscle that have a specific organization of the muscle fibers, such as the vastus lateralis, we can measure the pennation angle, so the inclination of the fascicles of the fibers compared to the final direction of the tendon. And this angle is important because resistance exercise may modify that architectural characteristic of the muscle. By knowing muscle thickness of the vastus lateralis, for example, and the pennation angle, we can calculate how long are the fascicles of fibers that are included in the muscle. So fascicle length, why this parameter is important? Because a muscle that include long fascicle is able to contract quicker, because a lot of sarcomeres are working in series, not in parallel, but in series. And that increase the speed of contraction. There is another parameter, if you remember properly, that can be measured by using muscle ultrasound, and is actually echo intensity. Echo intensity is basically how dark is the picture. And if the picture is very dark, then the muscle has an high quality. And this parameter, as we will see, is very correlated with power. For example, the muscle quality in woman sprinter is very correlated, about 0.8, 0.85, with the personal best in 100 meters run. So for sprinters, muscle quality is very important. That are the main characteristics that can be measured. And following a period of training that can be long or shorter, an increase in cross-sectional area that is usually measured by muscle thickness may be obtained. Usually it takes at least 4 or 5 weeks to obtain a real improvement in muscle thickness. Why? Because there are more sarcomeres in parallel. So the muscle, after this adaptation, should be able to increase the amount of force. However, sometimes it takes time to increase the level of force, because at the end, following a period of high volume training, for example, you need time to digest the entire amount of work that was performed. So at the beginning, fatigue may cover the improvement in force. Another adaptation may consist in an increase in pennation angle. So typically, resistance exercise increase the pennation angle, and then that may change the possibility of the muscle to work quickly. Because typically a muscle with an high pennation angle is less indicated for high speed change of direction for sprint. However, we need always to think that the muscle cross joints, there are leverages, so strength may be more important than the absolute speed of contraction for the final performance of power. For example, consider a sprinter such as Usain Bolt, that is pretty tall. His muscle are very fast. However, the leverages and the ratio between muscle and tendon is completely different compared to a shorter individual. Shorter individuals may may obtain good results if they have a shorter pennation angle, a long fascicle length, because they need really to have very quick muscle contraction. For Usain Bolt, that has long leverages, may be more important to be strong, because the leverage, the kind of leverage is most of the time negative. So you need a lot of energy to move the leverage. And strength is more important than speed. Okay, I don't know if I explained properly. This concept is not so easy to explain. So when pennation angle increase, also force is increased because the number of cross-bridge interaction in a given area of the muscle is increased. At the end, the anatomical reason why the muscle is pennated is to store a higher number of fibers within the same cross-sectional area, okay? Because what we measure, typically perpendicular to the fascia and the aponeurosis, is typical the anatomical cross-sectional area, while the physiological cross-sectional area take into account also the pennation angle. Okay, so if the pennation angle is increased, then the physiological muscle thickness is more elevated. However, as I said, the change in pennation angle may also change the possibility of the muscle to be contracted quickly, to perform quick contraction. Okay, but another adaptation that can be obtained, in particular when, okay, this is increase in muscle thickness, increase in the pennation angle, more sarcomeres in parallel was exactly the same. However, when we work both for resistance exercise and for power in training, as typically happen in complex training, or for example, when we combine sprints with squat, we may obtain an increase in fascicle length. And fascicle length is a parameter that is very related to sprint ability and also to change of direction, because, as I said, a longer fascicle length consent to work at the same time of many sarcomeres in series. And a longer fascicle length is consent to the muscle to be contracted, to be activated quickly. So more quickness, more speed of contraction, and at the end, this may result in an increase in power, especially in speed strength. So explosive strength with more focus on speed compared to strength, okay? So there is a continuum in force from maximum isometric force and the maximum rapidity. In the middle, there are all the different kind of forces, more to maximal isometric force when the speed of contraction is pretty low, more to maximum quickness, rapidity, velocity of contraction when the amount of force is lower, okay? And a longer fascicle increase usually the amount of power that can be produced, especially at low loads, okay? By combining resistance exercise with jumps, throws, and power training, we may be able to obtain also to increase the ratio between type 2 and type 1 fibers. Why? Because you obtain hypertrophy of the fast fibers, okay? Not because you change basically the kind of muscle fiber, because the number of slow fibers is the same and the number of fast fibers is the same. However, the intermediate fibers, the 2A, can go more to power or more to slow contraction and endurance activity, because they can change a little bit their characteristics. They can be adapted more to something related to maximum strength and power, or more to endurance events in relation to the stimulus, in relation to training. Okay, so based upon the kind of resistance exercise that we perform, we may obtain different morphological adaptation, and that this discovery is quite new, and only very recent books are starting to discuss about that, about the possibility to obtain different morphological adaptation with different strength training. So by using dynamic power exercises, we may obtain longer fascicles of the muscle. So the possibility to obtain quicker muscle contraction. And the increase in pennation angle is minimal, and there is a selective hypertrophy of fast fibers. Okay, so agility and change of direction together with sprint and power can have a big impact by these morphological changes. On the contrary, if I work only in the gym, especially with slow contractions, I may obtain an improvement in power, of course, because if I increase my maximum strength, at the end, I may also be able to produce more power. However, the left portion of the power, of the load power force, the graph that we just analyzed, may not be improved so much, because we may experience an increase in cross-sectional area that is actually good for power, but also an increase in pennation angle that is not always good for power. And also a change in the ratio between type 2 and type 1 fibers, because all the different kind of fibers can increase their size. So not just fast fibers, but also intermediate and slow fibers. Okay, so there is a different morphological effect. And typically, by introducing only heavy resistance exercises, the increase in the length of the fascicle is minimal. Okay, so in order to obtain this adaptation, science suggests to combine resistance exercise with power training in order to obtain that kind of morphological adaptation. So several different strategies and exercises can be adopted in order to increase power. For example, jumps. Jumps are very important to stimulate power. And based upon the kind of jumps that we introduce, we may obtain different effects. For example, jumping on stairs, like in the picture in the left, reduce the eccentric contractions, because you are not dropping at the same level at which you started the jump. And so by avoiding the eccentric contraction, you may reduce the inflammation muscle damage, because if you jump in a flat ground and you land at the same level compared to the one at which you take off, basically, you have a lot of energy to dissipate during an eccentric contraction. And as you know, this amount of energy that is dissipating during the eccentric contraction may produce some muscle damages. And following muscle damages, there is a phase of inflammation, and then takes time to recover. If you perform the same jumps, like vertical jump or counter movement jump, on a stairs, in which each step is about 40 centimeters, like in a stadium, for example, you reduce the amount of energy that should be dissipated during the eccentric contraction, and you minimize the amount of muscle damages. So that kind of jumps can be performed even during the in-season, even 3 days before a competition, while the other kind of jumps in which you land at the same level as the takeoff should not be performed close to the competition, because it takes a lot to recover. Okay, did you understand this concept?
Yes.
Okay, nice. Other kind of training for power are represented by medicine ball throws or shot put throws in different kind. You can also perform some like a sprint-specific running. It's that kind of training is called spatial training because basically you take your competitive exercise and you increase some of the parameters. It's typical the sledge pulling sprint. So basically you sprint for a sprinter that represent the competitive exercise, but you increase the load. So you pull a sledge. This is called spatial training because you try to reproduce the competitive exercise by introducing something that increase the stimulus of the same exercise. But also a specific resistance workout can be performed in order to stimulate power, and also weightlifting exercises. Why weightlifting exercises? Because while when you perform powerlifting exercises, deadlift, bench press, and squat, you may also obtain low level of speed of contraction because maybe you are intentionally increasing the time under tension or because you are using heavy loads. However, even if you are using heavy loads in weightlifting exercises, the quickness, the speed of contraction will be very elevated. That's the reason why weightlifting exercise may be optimal to stimulate power. Okay, we will talk about that. Okay, range of motion for muscle power. Typically, in order to obtain the highest level of power, we need to use the entire range of motion because by using it, we have more possibility to accelerate the load and to obtain higher velocities. However, in some contests, for example, sprinters use partial squats because they try to reproduce the level of the angle at the knee that is typical of sprinting. So for them, may be important to perform full depth squat only during the introductory phase or during the fundamental phase. As soon as they come close to the competition, most of them are not performing anymore full squat. They are performing parallel squat or a quarter of squat or 90 degrees squat because this angle is more similar to the angle typically represented in sprint. Okay, so they try to do something specific for what they are actually doing. And typically they perform very fast squat. It's very important for them to use like encoders, accelerometers, or like automatic stopwatch in order to measure the quickness of the repetitions and the power produced. And typically, when you work out for power, it's important to measure the power produced in each repetition. And as soon as this power is reduced, stop the set because you are not working anymore on power. You are working on power endurance, but you are not actually increasing your maximum possibility of jump, of throwing, and stuff like that. Okay. Okay, most of the exercises related to Olympic lifts include a very wide range of motion. So there is also a similarity. For example, for a javelin thrower, performing a snatch is very important because there is a big range of motion in the snatch and the stress in the shoulder may be for some aspect similar to the javelin, even if the technique is completely different and also the sequence of activation of the different muscle is very different. However, may be important for them to work with Olympic lifts. Ballistic versus non-ballistic contraction. Some of the exercises that we just described included ballistic contraction. What is a ballistic contraction? Is a contraction that does not end with the deceleration phase. So basically, this kind of contraction end with a jump or a throw, in which, in order to throw the object as far as possible, there is no deceleration at the end of the contraction, at the end of the range of motion, because the literature said that when you introduce a deceleration phase, a braking phase, at the end of the range of motion, the power goes down. It's lower compared to when you try to throw an object. That's the reason why, especially at low loads, it's very important to throw the object. If you want to increase your power during the bench press, it's important to include bench press throw instead of just high power bench, especially when you use loads like 30, 40, 50% of 1 RM. When the load is more elevated than 50% of 1 RM in the bench press throw, for example, there is no difference compared to ballistic versus simple concentric contraction. Because at the end, you cannot throw a load that is more, that corresponds to more than 50% of 1 RM. However, at lower loads, it's very important to perform ballistic contraction. Okay, very important. When you work out for lower body and the purpose is to increase the power of that muscle groups, is important to jump, to perform properly jump. So why I'm saying that to perform properly, for example, box jumps? Because many times, for example, in CrossFit, I don't know if in Kfar Sasa they perform jumps in this way, but most of the time they jump, but in order to be able to land on the box, they bend both knees and hips. However, if we are working with the strength and power athletes, the purpose is to obtain the maximum acceleration and elevation of the center of mass. So it's important to use a box lower in height to be able to land on the box without bending knees and hips.
We tell whoever jumps if they can to jump to land high, but there is a set height for the boxes, so most of them just jump to the box and land in a partial squat.
You are talking about CrossFit. So that's the reason.
Yes.
So they try to minimize the elevation of the center of mass in order to dissipate less energy, because maybe they have to jump for 50 times. However, if you are working with strength and power athletes and the aim is to increase the maximum power, then you need to jump in a different way. You need to do a few number of jumps at maximum explosive intent and with the aim of obtain the highest elevation possible of the center of mass. So the best way is to jump and to land on a box, a lower box, for example, 30, 40 centimeters or 50 if you jump a lot, if you are powerful, but without bending knees and hips. That stimulates the power much more compared to the typical CrossFit jumps. Okay. Most of the time, the reason why a lot of people is jumping in CrossFit, especially if you are not talking about professional athletes, is to burning calories. Okay, so for that purpose, also bending knees and hips may be functional. However, if you are working to increase the maximum power, then other strategies should be adopted. Okay. Bench press throw. So it's very important also, maybe also important to use throwing exercises, throwing medicine balls, and the same factor is valid. So few throws at maximum speed, maximum explosive intent to improve maximum power, especially when you are relatively fresh. You cannot increase your maximum power working on power when you are fatigued. So performing power exercises following a high volume resistance exercise is not useful, or is useful only to burn calories, but not to increase the performance. If we want to increase the performance of power, we need to include that kind of exercises at the beginning of the training session, as typically happen in mixed session periodization. Do you remember? When we organize the exercises and the strategies of training into a mixed session periodization, each workout starts with power training. Then we move to maximum strength, and at the end, some exercises, in particular monoarticular exercises for hypertrophy, so at high volume. But power was trained at the beginning of the training session. Okay, so including some power exercises at the end of the training session when you are already fatigued is not optimal to improve maximum power. Okay, maybe perform to increase your power endurance, so the possibility to produce power even when you are tired. That may be important in some sports. However, that is not optimal to stimulate maximum power. Okay, did you understand? Do you agree with me?
Yeah,
Do you agree with me or not?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I hope. Okay, so recently we did a study that is actually very interesting, because when you try to develop force and to obtain an adaptation in specific power exercises, the orientation of the exercise may be also important. So the vector of force production. So some exercises are considered horizontally loaded exercises. So in any case, the load is vertical. However, the position of the individual consent to consider the force like into horizontal vector. Typically, these exercises that are actually very popular for sprinters and for athletes involved in acceleration and running are, for example, hip thrust, that is one of the most popular women exercises, and reverse hyperextension, that is actually less popular because you need a specific device, a specific bench to do that, especially at with the external loads. Of course, you can perform it also by using a fit ball under your belly, and that's a very good exercise for the health of the spine. My suggestion is to perform it because it's very good. So basically, you take a fit ball, you grab a bench, and you lift your lower body. You can keep the position or doing like a small range of motion movement, bending the hips. And that works a lot for the spine extensors muscles, especially of the lower portion of the spine. And is very good also because there is the like non I don't know what to say like so there is the fit ball that and you need to work also on your equilibrium. Okay, so typically reverse hyperextension and hip thrust are considered exercises with horizontally load. Also, standing long jump, of course, the force vector is horizontal. On the contrary, other exercises that are considered at with the vertical load are squat, step up, that is considered one of the best exercises to activate the glute muscles, and also vertical jump. In this study, we compare these two kinds of exercises. So basically one group, the horizontal training group, composed by 10 individuals, used only horizontally loaded exercises. So hip thrust, reverse hyperextension, and long jumps. While the vertical group, that include 9 participants, perform only squat, parallel squat was, step up, and vertical jumps. The training for the upper body was the same for both groups and was equated. So both groups performed the same number of repetition, the total number of repetition. Of course, different exercises involve different loads. For example, the load that was lifted during the hip thrust was more elevated compared to the load lifted in squat, because in hip thrust you can easily lift 200 kilos. I was doing reps at 260 kilos, so you can quickly increase the load that you use. So they train 4 times per week for 6 weeks. And we also include a common sprint session, because we also measure the effect on sprint. So 3 training sessions in the gym, consisting in different exercises for the lower body and the same exercises for the upper body, and the same sprint session, 6 weeks of training. So the first limitation of the study, what is the first limitation of this study?
Short period of time.
Yes, 6 weeks is minimal, okay? Each group include both male and female individuals. What is another limitation of the study?
The amount of people. If it's also male, female, and it's also only 19 total, it's small.
Okay, it's not a lot, but when you work with highly trained individuals, it's not easy to find more than that.
Of
So
course,
that-
but it's not like heterogenic. It's divided as well.
Okay, because male and female were included
Yes.
in the group. Okay, so basically that is a shitty study. However, even
No,
if
no.
it's not the best, on Instagram, many influencers start to cite this study because we measure some of the parameters that are not usually considered in studies. So now I'm talking about that. So the assessment that were performed pre and post were muscle architecture of glutes, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and we measure also echo intensity, that is not always measured in training studies. So echo intensity was measured before in some studies, but acute studies. So that in studies that were assessing the recovery phase following a single session of training. So we measure also the sprint performance using photocell, so automatic stopwatch, and also 10 meters sledge pull sprint at 30 kilogram. That was 30 kilogram was the weight of just the sledge, without any additional load. Then we put 10% of the body mass of the individual on the sledge, and then 20% of the body individual on the sledge. So basically, we put the photocells and we measure the time on 10 meters at different load on the sledge, okay? Then we measure vertical jump performance and standing long jump, squat 1 RM and hip thrust 1 RM, okay? What do you think will be the result? What the literature says about that, about horizontally versus vertical exercises? So of course there is a different activation of the muscles, because typically when you work with horizontally loads, the activation of the glute may be more elevated compared to vertical exercises in which the quad is typically more activated. So let's see if that different exercise induce a different adaptation. So the results. So increase in muscle thickness of the vastus medialis only in the vertical group. So only the vertical group obtained an increase by 3% in the thickness of vastus medialis. Okay, the other group in 6 weeks of training without squat, consider that these athletes, these participants were highly trained and they were typically perform squat twice a week. So by removing this squat, they obtain a decrease by 7% of the thickness of the vastus medialis. So think about how important it is to include exercises for vastus medialis in women. For example, in soccer players. Women soccer players are very prone to injuries in the knees, and some of the injuries are related to the fact that the strength of the vastus medialis is not so elevated. So think about how important it is to perform vertical loaded exercises in this kind of athlete, okay? But if we take a look at the gluteus eco-intensity, because in both groups, the glutes mass increased. So the muscle thickness of the glute was improved in both groups. Why? Because both squat and hip thrust and reverse hyperextension at the end activate the glute. When you perform a full squat or like a step up, your glute is activated. So both groups experience a significant increase in the thickness of the glute. However, only the horizontal group obtain an increase in the eco-intensity of the glute. So we start to analyze the morphological adaptation of the muscle by different point of view. So one point of view can be related to mass. One point of view can be related to muscle quality. And the increase in muscle quality was more elevated by using horizontally loaded exercises compared to vertically loaded exercise. That is a discover that should be investigated again, because it's not fully understand. However, open a new perspective into resistance exercise adaptation. And other parameters are important, because this parameter of eco-intensity of the glute has a very high correlation to sprint. And by increasing this parameter, we may probably obtain a better increase, an higher increase in sprint. However, let's see the results in performance. So the group that perform squat obtain a higher increase in 1RM squat. Of course, how is called this principle? Principle of specificity. So if I perform squat, then I improve squat, okay? And the improvement in hip thrust 1RM confirm the principle of specificity. So the group that perform hip thrust improve significantly more the 1RM in hip thrust compared to the vertical group, okay? In standing long jump, the improvement was more elevated in the horizontally loaded group because of the specificity. If in training I'm performing long jumps, then my performance in long jump is probably going to be increased more compared to the vertical group. But we didn't obtain any significant changes in 10-meter and 20-meter sprints, and no improvement in the sledge pushing exercise. So in the 10 meters sledge pulling at different loads. We didn't obtain any improvement in that. If you take a look at the graph, then you can see that there is a minimal improvement in 20-meter sprints, especially in the horizontally load group. However, the difference was not significant. So we cannot say at the end that horizontally loaded exercises were better for sprint compared to vertically loaded exercise. What the literature suggests about that horizontally loaded exercises are better to improve the first phase of acceleration in sprint. Because in that phase, typically, the force is produced horizontally because you need to accelerate. However, during the high-speed phase of sprint, the kind of muscle contraction is more is more vertical because the center of mass should stay almost at the same level. So vertical exercises may be more important, especially vertical jumps, like repeated vertical jumps and subsequent vertical jumps, to maintain a high level of running speed. Okay, so horizontally loaded exercises, very good for acceleration. Vertically loaded exercises may be better for the high speed phase. However, in order to work out to perform some resistance exercise with an effect on the high speed phase of sprint, we need to use minimal time of contraction. So we need to be very quick. And one of the best way to work out on this specific component is plyometric exercises. Okay, plyometry, so drop jumps, basically. We will talk about that. So no change in sprints specificity. Limitation of the study, we already talked about that. Inclusion of both men and women, short duration, lack of sledge training in the program. So we didn't obtain improvement in sledge. However, we didn't also include the sledge into the training program. So that is another limitation. Okay, so when we work for power, we need to be focused on the total movement. So basically, the external focus is typically better than an internal focus. So external focus and feedback based on external parameters are more appropriate than internal for power development. Okay. And we need to be careful to give a moderate quantity of feedback, because if we say, okay, pay attention to your elbow, to your knees, to your core, then the participant is not able to adjust everything. So we need to be concentrated in only one aspect, especially with highly trained individual. I remember when I was an athlete and I was a shot putter, and sometimes my technique was not so good. So my coach used to say only one word and was the correct one to change the entire technique. And then the technique will move into something better. So it's very difficult to find the right word sometimes, but it's important to have in mind what is the most important parameter to be changed in order to obtain a better technique, a better performance. Okay, so few words are very specific, especially with the highly trained individuals and highly trained athletes. Okay. So an example of internal versus external instruction. I'm doing overhead press. By using an external approach, the instructions can be make the bar rattle to the top. So be fast in your lift. That's it. Okay. Using an internal approach of instruction, the suggestion can be contract your upper body muscle faster to push the weight. So is less direct to the actual performance. Of course, in order to use an external kind of instruction, the individual should be already able to have a good technique in the exercise. Okay. In what kind of fitness world internal focus and also internal instruction can be more important than external in bodybuilding, for example, because in bodybuilding you need to be concentrated, especially when you perform single joint exercises in the actual muscle that is working by introducing a good mind-muscle connection. And by using this mind-muscle connection, you can be able to concentrate more the exercise on a specific muscle. Okay, that is important, but only for bodybuilders, because athletes, even when they work out for hypertrophy, typically they are focused on the movement, and then the movement stimulate properly the different muscles. Okay, there is a different approach to that. Typically, they train the movement. Okay, so in order to improve power, ballistic contractions are important, but also using some strategy to measure the power in each repetition. This is typically allowed by the linear encoder, such as the tendon unit in the picture. So my suggestion is, if you work with strength and power athletes, you should be able to have one of these devices. Now there are some like a Vitruvian or stuff like that that are cheaper compared to the past. For example, the cost of the price of the tendon unit in the picture is about 1,500 euros or dollars, while the Vitruvian or other similar devices that are scientifically validated, so you can actually use it properly, are much less expensive, much cheaper. So I think in order to properly monitor the training, you need to use some of these devices. And as well, if you work with sprinters or with athletes that require a high level of performance in acceleration and sprint, it's better to use the photocells to measure the sprints, to measure the time even in the change of direction, because using the stopwatch in 2025 may be a little bit, you know. So my suggestion is to use technology if you have the possibility. Okay, what about using power alone or strength power in training? What are the different effects of using only power exercises or strength power? This study that was published by Prue Cormi in, I don't remember the year, okay, divided a group in 3 parts. So 10 individuals perform power alone, 7 sets of 6 jumps at body mass. Consider that in vertical jump, the body mass is typically enough to obtain the peak in power. Many times, some individuals may obtain a better performance in power with lower loads compared to their actual body mass. But by increasing the mass that is accelerated in vertical jump, typically a reduction in power is obtained. Okay, so another group composed by 8 individuals perform power and strength. So 5 sets of jump at body mass at the beginning, and then 3 sets of 3 squat at 90% of 1 RM. Okay, another group was a control, and they perform only strength. Okay, so the assessments that were performed at the beginning of the training period and at the end of the program include body mass jump, squat jump at 20 kilos, 40 kilos, 60 kilos, and 80 kilos more than the body mass. Okay. Some improvements were obtained in both groups. So both body mass group and additional load groups obtain some improvements. However, the improvements were different because the body mass group obtain improvement only at body mass. So the improvement when additional load were put on their shoulder was not significant. However, the group that perform body mass jump, but also additional load, so strength and power, obtain an improvement in jumps with additional loads. So I'm sorry, I think no, I made a mistake because the one group perform the jump at body mass, while the other group perform the jump always at body mass, but perform also high intensity squat. And by using high intensity squat, they obtain an improvement during the entire force power curve, basically, not only at body mass. They improve the same amount the body mass jump, but they also improve the jumps with additional load. So that was the difference between the two groups. Sorry, I was making a mistake. So did you understand the differences? So by using high intensity resistance exercise, squat, in addition to body mass jump, they obtain improvements in jumps with additional load. So the body mass plus 20 kilos, 40 kilos, while the group that perform only jumps at body mass without high intensity squat, they improved only at body mass. Okay, so the principle of specificity. So if you jump at body mass, the maximum of your improvement will be at body mass. However, if you don't jump with additional load, but you perform high intensity resistance exercise, such as squat, you may obtain some improvement in jumps with body mass plus 20 kilos, 40 kilos, 60 kilos, because you work out on maximum force. Okay, so did you understand that? What about snatch and the clean and jerk exercises related to weightlifting? As we said, in order to lift the bar using that technique, the speed of contraction should be very elevated. And this may have an effect on power, on jumps, for example, and on quick muscle contractions. So a review that was published on British Journal of Sports Medicine, that is one of the best journal in sports science, analyzed the possibility to obtain improvement in lower body power by using weightlifting exercises. And more than seven experimental papers were included in this review paper. So the question was, Olympic weightlifting exercise may be better than regular resistance training for vertical jump improvement? Olympic weightlifting improvement on vertical jump may be the same as plyometric exercises? That were the questions before the review. And the review tried to respond to that. And in order to respond to that, several different experimental studies were analyzed in order to see if snatch and clean and jerk may be comparable to the results obtained by plyometric exercises or by using regular lift, such as squat, deadlift for the lower body. So while when you perform weightlifting exercises, the power production is always very high. In squat, depending by the load, the intention, the explosive intent, the amount of power can be really different. So depends. So the results are that both Olympic weightlifting and regular lifts can improve the performance in vertical jump. But if you are working at a slow muscle contraction in squat and deadlift, for example, the improvement in vertical jump, may be lower compared to Olympic weightlifting exercises. Okay. Olympic weightlifting exercises and vertical jump present similar activation of the neuromuscular system, because the recruitment of fibers may be similar, and the kind of muscle contraction of the lower body during Olympic weightlifting is considered ballistic, so it's comparable to a jump. So that's the reason why there is a big effect on jumps of the Olympic weightlifting exercises. Okay, so regular resistance exercise may be performed with submaximal explosive intent, while Olympic weightlifting exercises include a very high expression of power. Okay. So if you consider the power produced at the different exercises, including Olympic weightlifting exercises, you can see the difference in the power. For example, in deadlift, a heavy elite athlete lifting 93% of his 1 RM may produce 1200 watt of power, while a light elite individual, so the load is pretty lower compared to the previous athlete, lifting in snatch is 95% of 1 RM, may produce 2800 watt, so more than twice. And in clean, the power is even higher, because an heavy elite individual lifting 92% of 1 RM may produce 3800 watt. That is one of the most elevated power production an individual is able to obtain. So Olympic weightlifting exercises are very important to stimulate power. What is the problem of these exercises? That the technique is sometimes difficult to perform in a correct way, and for some, especially for some areas of the body, the exercises may be quite traumatic, and some injuries may happen, especially in the shoulder and elbow, because of course almost all the strength and power athletes are strong in the back extensor muscles, so they may have no problem in performing a snatch or clean and jerk. However, for some of them, the joint mobility of the shoulder may be not enough to properly perform snatch or clean and jerk. I remember I did a lot of these kind of exercises, because for throwers are very important. However, at the end of my career, I was not able to lift the same load because shoulder pain, elbow pain. So right now, sometimes I'm performing snatch, but every time I do that, for 3 days, I cannot properly move the shoulders. So I stop doing that, and I prefer bench because I can recover quickly. However, they are optimal to stimulate power. So if you can do it in using a correct technique, they are very useful. Most of the time, athletes of different sports that are not weightlifting, of course, they use part of the Olympic lift as exercises, or some portion of the entire technique. For example, they may perform like a hang snatch or power snatch. Hang is when you lift the bar not from the ground, but at different height. And power snatch means that you are not going very deep in the squat in order to catch the bar, but you are actually lifting the bar more. And that is more important for some athletes, may be more important to lift quickly the bar and without going deep under the bar to stimulate power. Because some athletes, I remember athletes from the Italian national team, they say, okay, so there is a good correlation between hammer throw and the 1RM in snatch. So I start to lift weights and to train with weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting coaches in order to lift more in the snatch. So then I may obtain a better result in hammer throw. However, if you lift more, not because you are more powerful, but just because your technique is better and you go more down to the bar and you move and you lift the bar at a lower height and you go under the bar, as weightlifter athletes do, at the end, the correlation between this performance and your actual throw is lower, because the correlation is more elevated if you are able to produce a very high amount of power, not because your technique is more close to the one used by weightlifters. Okay, I don't know if you understand that concept. So basically, if you increase your 1RM, but your production of power is the same, just because you are using a better Olympic technique, better Olympic weightlifting technique, that is not gonna produce an additional improvement in your own sport-specific performance. Okay, so that is good if you are a weightlifter. But if you are not a weightlifter, using some like a portion of the actual weightlifting exercise technique may be optimal to stimulate power. Okay, so for example, hang high pull is more popular than snatch in some among strength and power athletes, because it's less traumatic for shoulder and elbow compared to snatch and clean and jerk. However, these different exercises can be located in a different position in the continuum between speed strength, so explosive strength, but with more focus on speed, compared to strength speed, so explosive strength with more focus on strength, so at higher loads. So based upon the exercise that is used, the effect also may be different. For example, power jerk can be performed both for speed strength and for strength speed. However, clean pull or counter movement shrug and hang pull are more to the left, so to the right side of the continuum, so more to strength speed. So explosive strength with more focus on strength, because the load on the bar can be more elevated. Okay, there are several exercises that derivates by the Olympic weightlifting technique, but are something different, and are most of the time used because they are less traumatic compared to the full weightlifting technique. Okay, the last thing is a device that I developed about 10 years ago, and I obtained an industrial patent for that, and we also published a paper about that. I'm quite proud about that. It was an idea that I had during my PhD, and I was inspired by Russian scientist Kuznetsov, that in 1917 invented a static dynamic leg press. What was that? So we have only minimal documents about that. Apparently, this device could be stopped and immediately released. So at the beginning, the participant was able to perform an isometric contraction and then quickly release the possibility to move the press, and then an explosive contraction can be performed. Okay, so basically this device allows to quickly shift from an isometric contraction into a dynamic concentric contraction, okay? And this is similar to what I develop, and this is actually the device I patented. So I put some sensors and a magnetic device under the bar in a Smith machine. So these two elements were able to block the bar and also to register the amount of force that was produced during the isometric contraction. So basically the individual was asked to push the bar in the bench press, but the bar cannot be moved at the beginning. As soon as a certain amount of isometric force was obtained, then the bar was released and the individual was able to complete a concentric contraction, okay? So I have a video for that. I hope you can see it. So that was the device that register the force. So at the beginning, there is an isometric contraction, and then
It's
okay.
not dangerous? Like, do you understand like why I'm asking?
Yes, so you know why it's dangerous? Because when you perform such a muscle contraction, when you stand up, you are so activated that you can kill someone. For that reason, it's dangerous. No. Are you thinking about the possibility to obtain muscle
Dislocate or
tears?
something.
I
Like
think
because of the amount of force, and then you just explode and it keeps going, like you can't control it.
Well, I think it was not dangerous. So
Okay.
for bench press was very fun. Maybe for squat can be a little bit dangerous. So I think it's dangerous if you don't jump. For example, if you do like a mid-thigh pull using that device and you don't jump, that may be a little bit dangerous. But if you jump and if you learn how to do it, so how to switch between isometric contraction and into a concentric one, then it's not be so dangerous. So, and I obtain an industrial patent for that. And we also publish a paper on European Journal of Sports Science with Dr. Hoffman as well. So basically, in this paper, we compare different conditions. So what was defined a pre-isometric contraction, so pre-isometric activation. We set up a different threshold of release of the bar. So basically, in order to obtain a release of the bar, you need to reach 100% of your 1RM. The other condition was a low isometric pre-activation. So in order to obtain the release of the bar, you need to reach only 70% of 1RM, okay? And we compare the results in the power at different loads. So 20%, 30%, 40%, and 50% of 1RM on the bar. So the threshold of release was different because when you have 50% of the bar of your 1RM on the bar, then you need only 50% of your 1RM as isometric pre-activation. That was related to the magnetic stuff. Okay. While in the other condition, the amount of total force was lower because it was a low isometric pre-activation. Okay, so the total amount of load, the load on the bar and the isometric pre-activation in total was lower compared to the high isometric pre-activation. Okay, the two conditions. What we registered was that in correspondence of some loads, 20, 30, and 40% of 1RM, we obtain an improvement in power compared to the concentric only contraction. However, the improvement of power was significant only when the individual was asked to obtain the 100% of his maximum force before the release of the bar. If the amount of force required was lower, so low isometric pre-activation, then the power was lower compared to the regular concentric contraction. So only in particular condition of isometric pre-activation, the power produced was more elevated. Okay, that's quite interesting, and I think that more investigation should be performed in this direction. Right now, I'm building again the stuff in order to do some more studies about that. In particular, I want to test the effect on the EMG activation, on the muscle activation, and I would like to see also in chronic, so doing a training study in which some individual use that kind of device for training power and explosive strength and to assess the effects. Probably the reason why we obtained that was something similar to the stretch shortening cycle. Even in the plyometric exercises, there is a pre-activation because the eccentric phase can be considered as a different contraction history compared to the simple concentric contraction, and a pre-activation may occur. Okay, that was the last topic of the lecture. I hope you enjoy today's class. Have you got any questions? I would like to send you some papers to be read, like the one about isometric pre-activation. So I will try to put on the online platform, even if every time it's not easy. But I will try, or I can send to your email via my email address. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro.
You're welcome. I hope you enjoy the topics. See you on Monday. Bye-bye.